My name is Marlene Quinn. I'm 54 years old. I live alone in a modest walk-up in Seattle, and last Thursday I walked into my ex-husband's funeral, like I had every right to be there. I hadn't seen most of those people in over a decade. Judging by the way the room stiffened when I entered, they hadn't expected to see me either. The church hadn't changed. Same polished floors, same pale light filtering through the stained glass. As soon as I crossed the threshold, the air shifted. Conversations halted mid-sentence and a few heads turned like they'd seen a ghost. I took a slow breath, adjusted the collar of my coat, and walked down the side aisle. Douglas was at the front, laid out in a handsome oak casket surrounded by lilies and pale roses. His portrait on the easel showed him about 10 years younger, smiling the kind of easy smile that only ever made appearances in holiday cards. I hadn't seen that version of him in a long, long time. Caroline, his second wife, sat in the front pew, composed and elegant, a dry tissue pressed to her cheek. On either side of her were my daughters Lena and Audrey. Their expressions were tight, unreadable. Neither of them looked back at me. I didn't expect them to. I had been gone too long for this to feel anything close to a reunion. The whispers started before I found my seat. That's her, Marlene, after all these years. Some said it like I was a scandal, others like I was a ghost. I didn't let it touch me. My heels clicked quietly as I passed the rows of pressed suits and black dresses. The perfume of polite grief thick in the air. I took the last pew, the farthest from the front. I folded my coat neatly and sat with my hands in my lap. I didn't come to be acknowledged or forgiven. I didn't come to stir up old guilt or settle unspoken debts. I came because he had once been mine, and I needed to see that this chapter had really ended. There was a time when this church felt like part of my life. Sunday mornings with hot coffee and paper cups, the girls twirling in new dresses, bake sales and choir rehearsals, and that comforting rhythm of belonging. But things change. People adjust. When I disappeared, they erased me with surprising ease. The organ began to play low, familiar notes that blurred into the background. I let them fill the silence inside me, the space between who I used to be and who I had become. No one turned to speak to me. No one asked me why I came, and I didn't offer a reason. I hadn't worn black. Just a charcoal gray wool dress and the pearl earrings my mother gave me when Audrey was born. I wasn't here to perform grief. I was here to feel something end. Because before the silence, before the distance, before the years I spent rebuilding a life on the other side of the country, Douglas Quinn had once been my whole world. He had once laughed at my dumb jokes and kissed my paint-stained fingers. I needed to honor that part, not with flowers, not with tears, but simply by being in the room when it was over. I didn't cry, I didn't pray, I just sat still. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to remember. Not everything, just enough to say goodbye. I met Douglas Quinn on a rainy Thursday in September. I had just moved to Portland after finishing art school, working part-time at a framing shop and crashing on my cousin's couch. He was 2 years into his MBA and already spoke in phrases like strategic growth and capital yield. But that night he showed up to our mutual friend's dinner with mismatched socks and a bottle of wine. He forgot to chill. He was funny in a dry way, observant. I liked that he didn't talk just to fill space. We ended up standing by the sink after most people had left, sharing the last slice of cold peach cobbler right out of the dish with 2 forks. I hadn't expected anything, but when he walked me to my car in the drizzle, I remember thinking, I hope I see him again. We didn't fall fast. It was slower than that. Solid. Our second date was at a used bookstore that smelled like cedar and old paper. He watched me flip through art books, and I watched him compare business memoirs like they were sacred texts. We laughed about it later, that we came from different worlds but somehow found the same rhythm. By spring, we were living in a tiny third-floor apartment above a used bookstore with creaky floors and terrible insulation. The walls were so thin we could hear the old man downstairs sneeze, but it didn't matter. We painted those walls a soft green I chose from a hardware store clearance rack and split rent down to the penny. We kept a list taped to the fridge of every time one of us forgot to buy toilet paper. Money was tight. We ate a lot of boxed mac and cheese and Chinese takeout in paper cartons. On Friday nights, we would bring home a bottle of the cheapest wine and pretend to know what we were tasting. I used to sketch on the windowsills propped up with a blanket and a cup of coffee while he tapped away on his laptop at the kitchen table. We didn't have much, but it felt like we had everything. We stayed up late talking about our someday. Someday he'd start his own firm. Someday I'd have a studio with big windows and natural light. Someday there would be time for long vacations, lazy Sunday mornings, maybe even a backyard with hydrangeas. He believed in structure. I believed in color. We teased each other for it constantly. He'd joke that my paintings were all feelings and no function. I'd call his spreadsheets soul-sucking. It was playful, and behind it was real admiration. We knew we needed each other. He made plans. I reminded him to look up from the plan once in a while. We got married a year later in a city hall ceremony with just 10 people and an almond cake from a neighborhood bakery. I borrowed my sister's dress, and Douglas wore a suit he'd worn to 5 interviews already. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. The way he looked at me that day made me feel more seen than I'd ever felt. A few months later, we found out I was pregnant. Lena came first, then Audrey 2 years after. We moved into a small rental with a fenced-in yard. I stopped working full-time and picked up commissions here and there. Baby portraits, calligraphy murals for pediatric waiting rooms. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep my hands in paint. Douglas worked hard. I never doubted that. He was up before the sun and sometimes home after dinner. He kept talking about the firm he would start. I believed him. I saw how badly he wanted to build something of his own. I respected that hunger in him. We had a system. I handled the mornings, the grocery lists, the bath times, and bedtime songs. He handled the bills, the investments, the big picture stuff. On weekends, if we were lucky, we'd pile into the car for a drive out of the city, stop for pie at a roadside diner, and pretend for a couple of hours that the rest of the world didn't exist. There was real love in that life, not the kind you post about, the kind you grow by choosing it every day, even when you're tired, even when it's not easy. I didn't need roses or poetry. I just needed that familiar weight of his coat landing on the hook by the door, that smell of his cologne when he leaned over to kiss my cheek while I stirred pasta. He wasn't perfect, neither was I. But back then it didn't matter. We were building something together layer by layer. We laughed often, we argued kindly. We stayed up on New Year's Eve even when we were too exhausted to toast at midnight. Sometimes I wonder if love is clearest in hindsight, in those small, blurry snapshots you don't think are important until later. The afternoons he sat on the floor sorting Legos with Audrey, the night we danced barefoot in the living room after the power went out, the way he used to rest his hand on the small of my back while I brushed my teeth. That was the beginning. Before things shifted. Before the distance. Before the hollow parts started echoing louder than the good ones. There was once a time when Douglas Quinn and I were real, and that's what made everything that came after so much harder to understand. When we moved into the new house in Maple Ridge, it felt like the start of something. A freshly painted 2-story on a quiet cul-de-sac, all white trim and landscaped hedges. Douglas called it our reward for the lean years. He had just made partner at the firm. His suits fit better, his watch gleamed, and people started answering his calls on the first ring. I was proud of him, really. He had worked so hard. But something changed. Not long after we unpacked. He started coming home later. At first it was just an hour here or there, then it was whole evenings explained away by meetings or networking dinners. His phone buzzed constantly, always face down on the counter. I'd ask how his day was, and he'd nod without looking up. It wasn't that he was angry or cold. He just stopped noticing things. The girls would run to show him their drawings, and he'd smile without really seeing. I'd cook his favorite meals, and he'd barely register what was on the plate. He was in the house but not in the room. I tried not to take it personally. I told myself it was just a season that success demanded more of him now. I kept the routines going, breakfast, laundry, PTA meetings. I planted flowers in the front yard and picked out curtains for the den, like those things might ground us. In the quiet moments I painted. Not big canvases like before, just small pieces, birthday cards, watercolor bookmarks, little things I could do between packing lunches and folding towels. It wasn't much, but it made me feel like I still existed as someone separate from mother or wife. Some nights he'd come home and I'd catch a whiff of something unfamiliar. A new cologne maybe, a different energy. He'd talk about clients and new accounts with a kind of electricity he didn't bring home anymore. When I reached for his hand at dinner, sometimes he didn't even notice. But I didn't want to be that woman, the one who asked too many questions, the one who pressed or accused or made everything heavier. So I stayed quiet. I smiled. I gave grace. The girls didn't see it. To them, he was still dad, still showing up with ski trip plans and the latest phones and birthday breakfasts at the diner. I was the one behind the scenes reminding them to finish homework and pack snacks for practice. I told myself this was just marriage. that after so many years, the spark wasn't supposed to stay lit like it did in the beginning. You get busy, you get tired, you grow up. That's what I believed. Still, there were nights I lay in bed and watched the shadows stretch across the ceiling and wondered how long I'd been living beside someone who no longer knew what made me laugh. I missed him, not just the man I married. I missed being missed. And yet I kept going. I folded his socks into pairs. I left notes in his briefcase when he traveled. I waited at the window when he worked late. That kind of love isn't flashy. It doesn't sparkle, but I thought maybe it would be enough. I hoped it would be enough. It crept in quietly the way dust settles on a windowsill you stop looking at. At dinner, I'd ask how his day went and get a distracted fine sometimes. Not even that. His eyes stayed on his phone, which always lay face down, as if even its glow might betray him. I started noticing the way he looked past me instead of at me, like I was part of the furniture, like I belonged to the background noise of his routine. He didn't ask about the art classes I'd started teaching at the community center. When I showed him a painting I had spent 2 weeks on, he barely glanced up. "That's nice," he said already halfway into his email. I stood there holding that canvas like it was a piece of myself he couldn't see. And maybe he didn't. I tried harder for a while, changed the throw pillows, bought new curtains for the kitchen, made his favorite chicken and lemon soup from scratch on cold nights. Nothing landed. He ate without comment, left his plate in the sink, and disappeared into the office. Even our silences had changed. They used to feel like rest. Now they felt like absence. When he kissed me goodnight, it was more out of habit than affection. If he kissed me at all. Then came the gala. He had been chosen for some entrepreneurship award, and I wanted to be there. I picked out a navy dress that he once said made me look like dusk. I curled my hair the way he used to, like soft waves, nothing too polished. The ballroom was full of polished people and delicate laughter. Douglas moved through the crowd like he was born to be admired. I stood near the bar watching him work the room. I held my wine glass like it gave me purpose. He waved me over to a small circle of his colleagues. His hand grazed my back lightly, not affectionately, just a signal, and then he said it. "This is Marlene. She helps keep me sane." The group chuckled. I smiled, but my heart went still. Not my wife, not my partner, just someone who steadied the chaos, a comfort, a function. It wasn't the worst thing he could have said, but it was the moment something cracked. I laughed along because that's what you do. You don't ruin his night. You don't make a scene. You fold the pain into your dress seams and hold it until the ride home. In the car, I asked him quietly if that was really how he saw me. He didn't even look over, said I was being too sensitive, that it was just a line, just a joke. That word stuck in my throat. Sensitive, like it was something shameful, like I was the problem for feeling hurt. I looked out the window and counted the passing lights until we pulled into our driveway. I didn't cry that night. I didn't scream. I just sat on the edge of our bed with my hands in my lap and stared at the floor. I felt like a stranger in my own house, like I had become invisible to the one person who used to see me best. And maybe that's the cruelest part. Not the words said in anger, but the ones never said at all. Not being hated, just being slowly forgotten, quietly erased, until you start wondering if you were ever really there to begin with. The house was quiet that evening. Too quiet. I had turned on soft music just enough to fill the corners. Something instrumental, something calm. I wore the deep plum dress Douglas once said made me look like something from an old movie. I even curled my hair the way he used to, like loose and easy. The silver locket he gave me on our 10th anniversary sat warm against my skin. Dinner was almost ready. Lemon herb chicken garlic mashed potatoes, roasted carrots. The kind of meal I used to make when we were first starting out before takeout and conference calls took over our nights. I set the table for two, cloth napkins, the good wine glasses. I lit 3 candles down the center and dimmed the lights. 25 years, a quarter of a century. I didn't expect grand gestures. I didn't even need a card, just him, just a shared meal. A glance that said he remembered what day it was. I checked the time again. 6:30, then 7:10, then 8:00. The candles had burned down half an inch by then. By 8:45, I turned off the oven. The food sat untouched. I poured myself a small glass of wine and sat on the edge of the couch, watching the window like it might offer something. The street outside was quiet. A dog barked down the block. A car passed, but not his. At 10:00, I blew out the candles. The smell of wax lingered in the air, soft and bitter. I put the food into containers and stacked them in the fridge. I rinsed the wine glass, I took off the locket and placed it back in the jewelry box without looking. Midnight came and went. No call, no text. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the ceiling. There wasn't sadness anymore, just something still and cold. I wasn't angry. I was tired in a way I didn't have words for. The next morning, I heard the key in the lock. I didn't move, I just waited. He walked in wearing the same clothes he had left in the day before. He yawned, set his bag down, and headed straight for the kitchen. He asked if I'd made coffee. I stood by the sink and watched him pour himself a mug like it was any other day. He said dinner ran long, he crashed at the hotel. Didn't I see his message? There had been no message. I nodded anyway. I didn't trust my voice. I poured him coffee the way he liked it. Black, no sugar, a splash of cream. He thanked me without looking up. Something inside me settled then. Not a dramatic crash. Just a quiet end. The kind that happens when the last bit of trying slips away. I didn't ask why. I didn't accuse or cry. I just stood there in the kitchen holding the mug in both hands and let the silence answer for both of us. I had waited for him for years. Through missed dinners and forgotten birthdays, through silence and brushed off questions, but I wasn't going to wait anymore. That morning, I packed a small bag. Not everything, just enough. A few changes of clothes, my sketchbook, a pair of comfortable shoes. I left a note on the counter that said I needed time. I didn't say when I'd be back. I wasn't sure if I would. He didn't follow. He didn't call. Maybe he thought I'd cool off and return in a few days. Maybe he didn't notice the finality in my walk the way I didn't look back. But I knew. Something had shifted, and once that line is crossed, you can't go back. There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't scream. It doesn't break dishes or slam doors. It just disappears into the routine, one quiet moment at a time. And when it finally ends, it's not a crash. It's a release, like setting down something too heavy you carried for too long. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't feel triumphant. I just drove for hours. I stopped at a gas station off the highway and bought a coffee. I sat in the driver's seat and looked out across the lot and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Stillness. And for once, it wasn't lonely. That was the night I stopped waiting. Not just for him, for the version of our life that only I had been holding on to. I let it go without a speech, without blame, without regret. And in the quiet that followed, I realized I hadn't lost something. I had made space for whatever came next. The condo in Tacoma was nothing special. 2 bedrooms, a balcony that overlooked a parking lot, and carpet that needed replacing. But it was mine. For the first time in decades, no one else's name was on the lease. No one was waiting for me to make dinner or fold shirts. It was quiet, and at first that silence felt unbearable. I unpacked slowly, a few boxes each day. I told myself I had time now. No one needed me to rush. Most of what I brought fit into the smaller bedroom, which I turned into a makeshift studio. A folding table, 2 milk crates of brushes, and a worn canvas chair. The light was good in the morning. That felt like enough. I waited almost a month before touching the last box. It was labeled Studio in black marker, and I had shoved it into the back of the closet like it carried more than just paints and scraps. When I finally opened it, I found old sketchbooks, the dried-out palette I used during Audrey's senior project, and a tin of half-used charcoal sticks. At the bottom, wrapped in an old dish towel, was a thick envelope. The handwriting on the front was familiar. Sam. My brother had passed away the year before. Heart failure. Quick and cruel. He had always been the one who showed up without fanfare, bringing me coffee or a frozen pizza when I didn't know how to ask for help. I recognized his tone immediately. It just said, "For when you're ready." I sat on the floor and opened it. Inside was a short note from Sam. He said he had found the enclosed letter while helping me pack the last time. Said he didn't want to give it to me then because I looked so thin, so brittle. He wanted to wait until I had space for the truth. I don't know how he knew I'd be ready now, but he was right. The second envelope was unmarked. The paper was heavy, cream-colored. Tucked inside was a folded letter written in Douglas's handwriting. For a second, I thought it might be a joke or something impersonal, but the first line stole the breath right from my chest. "Marlene, if you're reading this, it means I didn't say it when I should have." He never apologized. Not exactly, but he told the truth. That he had stopped seeing me. That it hadn't been sudden. That it was easier to pull away than admit he felt like he was failing. He wrote that I had been the glue for so long that he forgot glue doesn't shine. He said he thought about reaching out. He didn't, said he convinced himself I was better off, but he never stopped watching. When Lana sent him a photo of one of my paintings at a gallery, he said he cried in his car. He hadn't known it would hit him that hard. He ended the letter simply, that he didn't know how to make it right, that he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He just wanted me to know I had never been invisible. Not to him, not really. I read it twice, then folded it gently and set it beside me on the carpet. I didn't cry. I didn't feel vindicated, but something in my chest loosened. Just a little, like letting air out slowly. I sat like that for a long time, not thinking, just feeling the shift. That letter didn't change the past, but it cracked open a space where the anger had lived, and in that space something softer started to grow. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it. The letter didn't fix anything. It didn't make the years of silence less sharp or undo the ache of all those empty dinners, but it shifted something in me. It reminded me that maybe I hadn't imagined everything, that maybe I hadn't been foolish to love him, even if I had stayed too long. I didn't reread it often, just once more a few days later. Then I folded it up and placed it in a wooden box with a few other small keepsakes that had somehow survived the years. It sat quietly in my closet not as a wound, but as a piece of the story I no longer ran from. What came next wasn't a transformation. I didn't suddenly become whole or inspired or unbreakable, but I started doing small things. I went back to the community center and asked if they needed help with the Tuesday art class. The woman at the desk smiled and handed me a clipboard. I said yes. When someone from the building asked me to coffee, we didn't talk about anything important, just the weather and books and how the elevators were always slow, but I smiled without pretending. That felt like progress. I started painting again, not for a show, not for approval, just for me. Some days it was flowers, other days it was just color, memory, texture. I let myself be messy. I let it not mean anything. For a long time, I had confused being needed with being loved. I thought if I could just hold everything together, I'd matter. But slowly, gently, I let go of that idea. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. I stopped organizing my day around someone else's comfort. I walked around the block most mornings. I started cooking meals for one without feeling sorry about it. I went to the library and lingered. No one expected me to be anywhere. And for the first time, I didn't feel lost in that. I wasn't angry anymore. That surprised me. I just felt aware, like a fog had lifted. I could see myself again not as someone abandoned, but as someone who had stayed strong in ways no one noticed. There's a kind of healing that doesn't announce itself. It comes in soft yeses, in quiet choices, in mornings where you realize you didn't wake up with a knot in your chest. I wasn't looking for a new story. I just wanted to feel like I belonged in my own again. I had spent years being edited out. Now slowly I was writing myself back in. Not out of revenge, not even from grief, just from respect. And that changed everything. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to feel like maybe I hadn't been the villain in his story. More importantly, I wasn't the villain in mine. The law office was colder than I expected. Gray walls, glass table, a vase of fake lilies in the corner. I sat in the chair closest to the door, hands in my lap, heart steady. I hadn't come for anything, certainly not money. I only came because Thomas Greer Douglas's attorney had asked me to. Candace was already there, seated at the head of the table like it was her right. Her mouth tight, eyes forward. Rachel and Elise flanked her arms crossed, postures stiff. None of them looked at me. I didn't blame them. Thomas cleared his throat and began with formalities. The language of law has a way of making even the most human moments feel like inventory. First the stocks, the vehicles, the accounts, a nod to Rachel's college fund, another to Elise's trust. All of it as expected. Then he paused, a long one, just enough to shift the air. To Marlene Hartley, he said. His voice stayed even, but I felt the words lodge in my chest. The property located at 278 Elmsworth Drive shall be transferred in full with no remaining debt. There was an audible gasp. I didn't move. That was our house. The one we bought just after his first big promotion. The one I painted top to bottom. The one I left behind when I moved out with the hydrangeas in the front and the cherry wood floors I insisted on. Candace's jaw tightened. Rachel blinked. Elise turned toward her sister, confused. No one said a word. Thomas continued. A creative arts fund, he read, will be established in the name of Marlene Hartley, with an initial value of $480,000. It is to be used at her discretion in support of women over 50 pursuing creative work. His voice didn't waver. Mine nearly did. For a moment, no one moved. Then I heard a chair creak as Candace shifted. The room felt like it was tilting, but I stayed upright. Thomas set aside the legal papers. "There's one more thing," he said. He pulled a smaller envelope from his folder. "This is a personal note, not part of the will." He unfolded it and read aloud. "If Marlene is in the room, then she's stronger than I ever was. I couldn't say it then, but she deserves everything I failed to give her." Silence stretched. No one spoke. No one looked at me. I didn't need them to. It wasn't a victory. It wasn't justice, not really. But it was something close, something I couldn't name. I didn't want to cry. I didn't want to stay. I just wanted to carry that moment out with me untouched. Candace stood without a word and walked out, heels clicking like punctuation marks. Rachel stared at the table. Elise looked like she might speak, but didn't. I rose from my chair, nodded once to Thomas, and left without turning back. Outside, the air felt different, brighter maybe, or maybe it was just mine now. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt seen, and for once that was more than enough. The house looked smaller than I remembered. Maybe it was the years, or maybe it was the quiet. The garden had swallowed itself. Ivy wrapped around the porch railings. Weeds pushed through the walkway cracks. But beneath it all, the hydrangeas I planted were still there, stubborn and soft. I stood on the front step for a long time before unlocking the door. It still creaked, the kind of sound I used to complain about, but now it felt like a welcome. The air inside smelled like dust and old wood, familiar and faded. I didn't rush to fix anything. I swept slowly, one room at a time. I opened windows, let the air change. I found one of the girls' old drawings still taped behind the laundry room door, a lopsided dog and marker. I smiled and left it there. I didn't redecorate to recreate the past. I chose colors I love now, softer tones, fewer things, just enough to make it mine. I kept the books, replaced the curtains, cleaned out every drawer with care. In the back room, the one we once called the office, I set up a small studio again. Not grand, just a space to paint without pressure. I bought fresh brushes, new canvases, let myself play. The fun Douglas left sat untouched for a while. I wasn't sure what to do with it. Then one night I dreamed of Sam. He was sitting at my kitchen table grinning like he used to when he brought over pie. I woke up with tears on my cheek and an idea in my chest. I used a portion to start the Sam Memorial Grant. Small, focused, personal. For women over 50 who wanted to create something even if no one had ever asked them to. I wrote the first check with both hands, as if he were helping me sign it. Applications came slowly, then steadily. Letters from women who had been caregivers, office workers, waitresses, who had once painted or danced or written poetry in journals no one read. They thanked me, but I wanted to thank them. I kept the rest of the fund quiet, not a reward, not revenge, just something that allowed me to exhale for the first time in years. I still lived simply, still drank the same brand of tea, still took walks without my phone. What changed was smaller than people expected. I laughed easier, I spoke slower, I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't look away. I no longer needed to prove anything. On most mornings, I sat by the window with my tea. The sun came in through the east-facing glass and warmed the floor. I watched it stretch across the wood like a slow promise. There was nothing dramatic about it, no grand new chapter. But I wasn't afraid anymore, not of the morning, not of the silence, not of being alone. Closure didn't come with court papers or confessions. It came in small moments, in being seen when I least expected it, in seeing myself when no one else was watching. And that was enough. That was everything.